Hello everybody. Today we have the second video in our unit about human appropriation of ecosystem goods and services. And the issues we're going to cover today are deforestation and modern agriculture. So let's get started. It is thought that about 5 billion hectares on Earth, out of about 13.5 billion hectares, were covered in forest. Currently, there are somewhere around 3.9 billion hectares of land characterized as forests. So that sounds pretty good. We have 78% of the forest remaining. The problem with that is it's thought that less than 40% of the remaining forest is actually healthy, non-degraded forest. So about 1.6 billion hectares, or 32% of the original forest, is actually high quality, relatively undisturbed forest that contains high biodiversity and relatively high productivity. Now, currently, estimates on the rates of deforestation range from about 3.3 million hectares per year to 29.4 million hectares per year. I tried to find what's a respected figure, and the one I came up with by looking at a lot of different reports was about 7.5 million hectares per year. To put that into perspective, that's the equivalent of 20 international soccer fields being cleared a minute. These forests are typically destroyed for commercial purposes, such as the planting of palm oil or meat production or other commodity production. And these are done by large-scale operations. And the other thing that's done with forests is logging for valuable timber. Now, it is true that once a forest is open for logging, which means that roads are built through it, then poor people, often squatters, do move in, and the use of the forest at that point, by them, potentially prevents effective regrowth. In many places, unless logging industries are required to replant, no replanting is done. Now, in the case of agricultural operations, there's no attempt ever to restore the forest. The land is put into agricultural use. So forests can be replanted, and in many places, particularly in developed countries, a logging operation will be required to replant it. But the problem is these forests have reduced biodiversity. And they have reduced biodiversity because they lack ecological complexity. For example, all the trees are the same age. And there's a lack of the natural tree diversity. A company that replants trees will typically plant one or two or three kinds, not all the kinds that were originally there. And another thing I want you to know about forests, it is widely believed that tropical rain and cloud forest does not regenerate in any reasonable amount of time. So there is no such thing as sustainable clear cutting of a tropical rain or cloud forest, whereas a pine forest in the southeast United States can be clear cut and replanted and regenerate in a reasonable amount of time, 30, 40, 50 years. What are the effects of deforestation? Well, you probably can figure out a few, but here's a laundry list, and I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. First, flooding and landslides. There have been many examples of flooding and landslides that are caused by deforestation. Philippines in 2004, Thailand in 1989, and China in 1998. And these aren't me saying that that's what caused it. These are the official analysis after the fact by people in those countries who looked at it and said, why did this happen? Oh, this happened because of deforestation. So how does it happen? Well, why does deforestation create flooding and landslide? Well, when deforestation happens upslope, anywhere really, the forested areas no longer retard runoff, and therefore deforestation increases surface flow. So forests have the effect of mitigating large rainfall, whereas a lack of forest means that there's much more surface runoff and much more erosive capability. I still remember well being in the Chiricahua Mountains in Arizona the summer after a major forest fire, and all of a sudden hearing the flood come down the mountainside. I had been to the Chiricahuas for 4 or 5 summers previously, and it had rained upslope many times, and I never noticed a change in the sound of the stream that ran through our campus. And this time you could hear the roar, and it was frightening. Fortunately, in that event, the water was high, but it wasn't high enough to flood our compound. But it was a terrifying event. Deforestation leads to drought. Quick runoff means less groundwater, less percolation into the ground, and that means less river water over time. And so this increases the likelihood of drought during the drier seasons. Now, here's a surprising one. Deforestation leads to change in rainfall patterns. Trees transpire water. That means they bring water up through their roots, through their trunks, out into their leaves, and into the atmosphere. They evaporate water. And even though it's a small amount of evaporation compared to the amount of water that's held in water vapor, it's often enough to tip highly saturated water over the point at which it becomes supersaturated, and therefore the point at which rain occurs. And so it's now been noted around the world that without forests, less rain falls. And when less rain falls, net primary productivity declines. Deforestation leads to a loss of biodiversity. Forest loss means less habitat for other species. Half of all terrestrial plants and 75% of all birds live in forests. So loss of forests means loss of those species, at least a decrease in their population. Loss of climate mitigation. You probably get this immediately. Forests are large carbon sinks. Photosynthesis captures a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere. Forests are very efficient at storing that in root biomass, trunk biomass, soil organic matter. And so when forests are cut down, standing biomass, soil organic matter are destroyed. The ecosystem that follows a cut down forest is often not as productive for several years and therefore doesn't take as much carbon out of the atmosphere. And finally, economic loss is a big deal. It is estimated that 1.6 billion people, so that's about 1 in 6 people, rely on forests for their livelihood. If forests are being lost, those people are having to find other sources of work. So that's a thumbnail picture of deforestation. It's an issue that deserves a lot more attention. Next, I want to talk to you about agriculture. It turns out, as you probably imagine, a huge percentage of the land on Earth is used for agriculture. A little less than half of all habitable land on Earth is used for agriculture, in fact, and we're going to see that in the next slide. About 1.5 billion hectares, or about 11% of the land area, not including Antarctica, is devoted to crops, and about 4 billion hectares is devoted to livestock. So let's look at this graphically. Here we can see that the Earth's surface, about 29% is land. Of that 29%, 70% is habitable, 30% is not. Of that habitable land, about 50% is used for agriculture. Of that 50% used for agriculture, about 77% is used for livestock. Of that amount of land in agriculture, 83% of the calories come from plant-based food and 17% from livestock. And finally, for protein supply, about 33% come from meat and dairy, and about 67% still comes from plant-based food. By the way, you will notice that the units here are different than the units we've been using of hectares. To convert these numbers to hectares, just simply multiply them by 100, and then you'll have it in hectares, because 1 square kilometer is 100 hectares. Let's think about what traditional farming was like in Western societies. Up until World War II, farming caused many fewer environmental problems because of 2 practices that all farmers used. One was crop rotation and the other was mechanical cultivation. Let's explain those. Typically, a farmer would grow a cash crop for 1 to 2 years, soy, let's say, and then they would plant the field in a combination of pasture plants, including nitrogen-fixing legumes, for a year. And they would sometimes, if they had them, livestock would be grazed on this fallow land. So that year of fallow, where the land was not growing a cash crop, nutrients were restored to the soil. And you might get some cows off them, and then the cow manure would fertilize the soil. And then after that, cash crops could be grown for a year or 2 again before you had to fallow it again. In addition, weeds were controlled by mechanical cultivation, which meant that you drove a plow through the crop to kill the weeds. Modern agriculture, which is also known as industrial agriculture, which has been largely developed since World War II, and the story of how industry developed it is an amazing story, which we don't have time to go into. But it depends on the input of synthetic pesticides, which are better called biocides. They don't just kill pests, they kill life. And depends on the application of synthetic fertilizers. Instead of growing your fertilizers by a fallow year, you now put chemicals on. It also depends on huge machinery powered by fossil fuels, not animals to do the plowing, and not small tractors, but large tractors. And each of these things comes with its own problems. So let's look at those. Pesticides are required to control disease, competitors, and herbivores. When we are controlling disease, we might call the pesticide a fungicide or a bactericide. When they're controlling weeds, we call them an herbicide. And when they're controlling insect pests, we call them an insecticide. Fertilizers are required to maintain the nutrient supply in the soil because virtually no farmer does the fallow year anymore. And why don't they do the fallow year? They don't do the fallow year because there has been a falling rate of profitability on their land. And that falling rate of profitability means that they have to plant more land. And the best way to plant more land is to take your fallow land and plant it. So fertility would decline, and one way to offset that decline is to just dump the nutrients that you need onto the soil. Similarly, the machinery has gotten larger over time because with more acreage being planted, farmers need to have larger machines to cover more acreage in less time. And I want to point out that one of the reasons that the profit per acre is falling is because farmers are using these capital inputs. They used to not use as many pesticides, used to not use as many herbicides, used to not use as many insecticides, but now they have to pay for that. They didn't have to use fertilizer before, they have to pay for that. They had smaller machinery that they were able to fix more easily. Now they have more complex machinery that costs more and may require a mechanic who has a degree in dealing with computerized systems. Modern agriculture is capital intensive, and I want to point out that means it's not available to poor farmers who don't have the capital to invest in the equipment and the inputs. So what are the environmental problems associated with modern agriculture? Well, you probably could figure out some of them. First, the biodiversity loss. If land is being used for agriculture, other species can't use it. In addition, there's the problem of biotoxins, which we studied in the environmental health unit. Pesticides cause all the same types of problems in the environment that we saw in human health. For example, endocrine disruptors disrupt the endocrine systems of animals. You could see, for example, the historical case of DDT and its effect on birds, or the Lake of Pope in Florida chemical spill that affected alligators, and there are just tons of examples of that. The other thing we should say is that pesticides themselves are addictive to farmers. They increase the likelihood that they will be needed to be used again and then continuously. And thus, pesticide loads increase over time. So the health effects are likely to be those that you see with bioaccumulation and biomagnification. The next effect of modern agriculture is increased nutrients in ecosystems. And we are going to study this in more detail later on in this unit. Two problems are eutrophication, which is what happens when nutrients get into aquatic ecosystems. And in terrestrial ecosystems, you get a loss of biodiversity and a loss of productivity and a loss of stability in the long run. And as I said, we will come back to this later. Clearly, agriculture makes a contribution to global warming and climate change. The increased use of fossil fuels in agriculture has contributed to global warming. And feedlot meat production, as well as the use of corn and soy as feed for cattle, because those are not natural foods for cattle, has increased methane, which we know is a much more potent greenhouse gas. Agriculture increases runoff and erosion. Because agriculture creates fields that are devoid of vegetation for some part of the year, any rainfall during those parts of the year will increase the amount of erosion. In addition, lack of plants increases runoff, so that further increases erosion. And the converse of increased runoff is decreased percolation, which means therefore a decrease in groundwater supplies. More runoff, more soil erosion. More soil erosion decreases the quality and therefore the productivity of soil. And it also increases the turbidity of water, which kills aquatic organisms, decreases light penetration, and therefore decreases photosynthesis in aquatic plankton and aquatic plants. Then we have the issue of loss of soil productivity. Soil ain't just dirt. Soil is the product of ecosystem processes that give soil structure that's created when mineral particles mix with organic matter. This creates many niches for a highly diverse soil biota, the organisms that live there, and these all combine to maintain physical and mineral fertility. And by physical fertility, I mean the ability of the soil to store water, the ability of plant roots to grow easily through the soil. And mineral fertility refers to the nutrient minerals, mainly nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And so, as soils are used in agriculture, they become less conducive for plant growth over time and therefore decrease the productivity of crop plants. So, you need to take steps to ameliorate that. And the current modern step is to just add nutrient fertilizers to it. In addition, agriculture creates a need for mineral nutrient replenishment because harvesting crops takes away a lot of minerals. And it destroys soil communities, largely by pesticides, and it destroys the physical structure, compaction by machinery, erosion, loss of soil organic matter because there's less material being put in because some of it is harvested. All of these decrease soil productivity. So that is another issue of modern agriculture. And finally, a lot of modern agriculture is irrigated. We haven't talked about that yet. And this often causes the depletion of non-renewable aquifers. These are underground water supplies, the most famous in the United States being the Oglala aquifer of the Great Plains. And that aquifer is declining. And in addition, we see throughout the western United States the loss of flow in rivers as agricultural water is used. And in the Colorado River, where the headwaters are in the United States and the delta is in Mexico, virtually no water was making it to Mexico until a recent treaty mandated that the United States could not use all the water. And in Asia, we've seen the Aral Sea disappear in a period of 30 years, or at least be reduced to a teeny portion of what it was, due to the use of water for agriculture. So that covers the two issues I wanted to cover today. Hopefully you have a better understanding of deforestation, its extent, and the ecological and environmental problems that are caused as a result. And hopefully you know a little bit more about agriculture now, as well as the problems that have come from the modern agricultural project. Until next time, study hard.